Hi everyone, welcome back to AP Environmental Science. In today's video, we're going to be covering topic 6.2 as well as 6.3. All right. That's where I want to go. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. This is topic 6.2, human impacts on wetlands and mangroves. So first we have to talk about what exactly is a wetland, and it sounds exactly like it is exactly like how it sounds. So a wetland is an area that has the soil partially submerged or saturated in water for at least a part of the year. And it's shallow enough for emergent plants. So what does that mean? It means that you have root systems that are partially saturated or completely saturated in water, but the plants are still able to grow up and out of the water. That way they can photosynthesize. So these wetland plants have adapted to living with roots submerged in standing water. Typically, plants do not like to be waterlogged. Their root systems do not like that. They can lack oxygen, but these plant systems have adapted to live fully submerged in water for at least a part of the year, or sometimes for the entire year. Just depends on the wetland. Wetlands also have a variety of ecosystem services. So for provisioning, they provide a habitat for animal and plant foods. For regulating, they help with groundwater recharge. Remember, the majority, if not our primary source of fresh water, does come from the ground, which is why it's so important that we do not have such high percentages of impervious surfaces so we can have groundwater recharge. Wetlands help with groundwater recharge because they absorb a lot of precipitation and flood water and help bring it back underground into aquifers. They also help with carbon dioxide sequestration. Remember, plants do photosynthesis. They will be absorbing CO2 and storing it in order to make glucose. For supporting water filtration, they help with pollinator habitats, nutrient cycling, and pest control. All different types of habitats and ecosystems provide different types of ecosystem services, but wetlands are incredibly important because of these different services they do provide. And as a side note, wetlands are very productive. They have really high rates of photosynthesis. And cultural, tourism revenue, fishing, camping, all different kinds of medicine can be found in wetlands, which is great. So overall, they are wonderful habitats. And in New Jersey, a big chunk of New Jersey is a wetland, particularly along the coast in the south. And we have laws and regulations where if you want to build on a wetland, you actually will not get approval to build there unless you come up with a plan saying that you will restore what you're taking away in a wetland somewhere else. So, for example, if we wanted to build a high school that was 5,000 square feet on a wetland, you would have to come up with a plan and funding to remake another wetland that's 5,000 square feet or more to replace what you're taking away. Again, why do we have to do that? Because these different types of habitats, these wetlands, are so incredibly important. They're very biodiverse and highly productive. And mangroves are like an example of a wetland. They're very, very, very common and important, especially in tropical areas like in the Caribbean or any island in South Atlantic, in between North America and South America. So mangroves are so incredibly important. They provide a variety of ecosystem services and different things to help with not just animal life, but human life as well. So mangroves provide things like wood. The density of it makes it a really valued source of timber and fuel. We'll actually talk about different types of fuel sources in our next upcoming unit on energy. But wood is a substance fuel, meaning that it is renewable as long as you're maintaining sustainable levels of what you're harvesting. So we'll talk about that later. In terms of like climate, fisheries, tourism, mangroves are very important because they help with all of the things that we've learned about so far. So maintaining biodiversity, carbon sequestration, productivity, all of these things, they're very, very, very nice. And another big thing is the water filtration, recharging our groundwater that we use for everyday things. Now, what are the threats to them? Logging, agriculture, aquaculture, which we'll talk about later, pollution, coastal development is a huge one, and of course, climate change. So, logging is the removal of trees from an area. So, when you are removing the mangrove trees from a wetland area, from the mangroves, for the purpose of fuel, you're causing habitat fragmentation, which is when you're breaking up the habitat. And because you're getting rid of trees, you're decreasing your rates of photosynthesis as well. Agriculture is turning the areas that did have the mangrove trees and the wetland into an area for the purpose of growing crops. The biggest one would be rice, because the root has to be totally saturated for it to grow. Aquaculture, which is something we'll talk about later in this unit, it's kind of the same thing as like a farm for crops, but rather than a farm for crops, it's a farm for fishing. And pollution is another big one, something we'll talk about later this year. But all life, including plant life, is very sensitive to marine pollutants, such as marine plastics and microplastics, and so on and so forth. Coastal development is building on a wetland. And New Jersey has these nice laws where you have to rebuild what you take away, but other parts of the world do not have that. And climate change, of course, is a big one. Going back to our Unit 4 on biodiversity, on ecological tolerance, all living things have a range of which they prefer to live in. Think of the corals in the coral reef gizmo that we just did. They have a specific range of pH and temperature that they thrive in. If you go outside of that range, they're not going to survive or reproduce as successfully. So the same thing with mangroves in these wetlands. Too little or too less rainfall, too much or too little sunlight, too high or too low of a temperature, you're going to have a struggle for survival. Okay. Now, this is all about threats to wetlands. So pollutants, this can also include natural pollutants such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which can cause eutrophication, our next topic we're going to go over. Sediment, motor oil, pesticides, endocrine disruptors. These are all things that can be released into the environment and cause an issue with populations growing and surviving. Development, wetlands can be filled in or drained to be developed into homes, parking lots, stores, whatever. And we should know way back at the beginning of this year that homes, parking lots, stores, those are all impervious surfaces. They do not absorb water. It's going to increase runoff, decrease groundwater recharge, which is not good. So water diversion upstream for flood control, agriculture, or drinking water can reduce water flow and dry up wetlands. This is what's happening right now in the Florida Everglades. And dam construction for flood control and hydroelectric power reduces water and sediment into wetlands, which can be an issue because, again, all living things have this ecological tolerance, the range which they best survive and reproduce. Overfishing disrupts food webs of wetlands, which we'll see later in this in this unit. Okay, now let's talk about eutrophication. This is something I'm going to breeze right through because we've talked about this a little bit before earlier when we have done Unit 3 on the nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus cycle. Okay, so eutrophication. Oh, let me move my face over here. Can I make myself smaller? Excellent. Okay, so eutrophication, remember, nitrogen and phosphorus are limiting nutrients. They tend to exist in very small quantities in the environment because it is really hard, especially for phosphorus, to go from its sedimentary state where it's trapped in rocks into a usable state where it's like in the ground or in local waterways to be absorbed by aquatic or plant life. So these things exist in small quantities. Because of that, they limit how much organisms or species or populations can grow and thrive. Nitrogen and phosphorus are needed to construct DNA, which is the building blocks of life. So without it, you can't have life growing, which is, again, why they're limiting nutrients. So when you have extra inputs or excessive nitrogen and phosphorus in a local waterway, it can lead to eutrophication, which is excessive nutrients, which fuels algae growth. Algae are producers. They perform photosynthesis. They're using energy from the sun, water, as well as carbon dioxide in order to create oxygen and sugar, which sounds great because we know that highly productive ecosystems tend to be the most biodiverse. However, nature likes to stay in balance. We don't like when things get too out of control, and eutrophication is things definitely getting out of control. So what happens is an algal bloom will cover the surface of the water, blocking the sunlight and killing the plants below the surface. The algae eventually die off. It doesn't live forever. Bacteria will break down the dead algae and use up all the oxygen in the water. Bacteria are doing aerobic respiration. Aerobic means using oxygen. So they're performing cellular respiration. That's what bacteria do. And when there's so much algae dying, they're going to be consuming that and breaking it down, doing cellular respiration, using all of the oxygen. And what do animals that animals that respirate, perform cellular respiration, release? They release CO2. So you have a decrease in oxygen in the water and an increase of CO2, which isn't good because we should know by now that CO2 and water, when they mix, make carbonic acid. That decreases the pH of anything, including water. So because of this, we're going to have a mass die-off of fish in our waterways, which is a problem because fish are a primary source of food for humans and animals above it in the food chain. Because the fish and other animals are dying, this is using up even more oxygen to decompose the dead aquatic animals and thus releasing more CO2. So this creates a positive feedback loop. And if you guys are not familiar with feedback loops from bio, please come see me, come talk to me. I'll review feedback loops with you. But typically positive feedback loops amplify or increase the stimulus or what's causing something, whereas negative feedback loops, the output, the response tends to stop or inhibit the input. So if you need a refresher on that, come talk to me, or I can post a review video somewhere for you if you don't remember feedback loops from bio. So this process is a positive feedback loop. The less oxygen you have, the more dead organisms, more bacterial composition, the less oxygen you have. It's creating, a cycle that doesn't stop. Okay. So how do humans cause this? Anthropogenic, which is human-caused nutrient pollution that leads to eutrophication, can come, from a few different things, primarily discharge from sewage treatment plants, animal waste from CAFOs, which is going to be our agricultural fields dedicated towards raising cattle. Okay. And another one is synthetic fertilizers for crops, which is something that we've discussed already heavily so far this year. Any more? Oh, okay. Sorry, it's not clicking for me on my end. Okay, here we go. No. Okay. So let's now talk about oligotrophic waterways. And the last few things we're going to talk about. So these are waterways with very low nutrient levels. They have a stable algae population and high dissolved oxygen, which is good. That way we can support the aquatic life in the food chain that does need to use oxygen for photosynthesis. This could be due to lack of nutrient pollution or the age of the body of water. Aquatic ecosystems naturally undergo succession. You do have a change in aquatic ecosystems over time. So sediment buildup on the bottom, the benthic zone, leads to higher nutrient levels. Over time, ponds naturally shift from oligotrophic to mesotrophic to eutrophic, And we can see that here. So the oligotrophic is like essentially the very basic starting point of your aquatic system. okay? You have low nutrients, stable algae, and high dissolved oxygen. Then over time, as you have more and more life coming in, you have equal rates of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. You still have stable levels of nutrients. That way there's no algal bloom and everything is nice and good till eventually they reach a climax community. So a decrease in dissolved oxygen is hypoxia. This is what causes a dead zone. This is what happens when you have the huge drop in oxygen, which is going to happen when you have the bacteria decomposing all of the dead algae as well as the dead fish that are now dying because of lack of oxygen. So these dead zones are where you have the lack of oxygen. All aquatic life requires dissolved oxygen and water for respiration. Remember, plants also do cellular respiration. They do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. As your dissolved oxygen decreases, fewer species can be supported. Most fish require at least 3.0 parts per million to survive and 6 parts per million to reproduce. So we can see here that the more dissolved oxygen you have, the more fish populations you can support. You're not sharing the resource. Everyone has an abundance of what you need in order to survive and reproduce. And that is it for today. I will see you guys all in the next video. If you need anything, let me know. I will be after school, as you know, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. If you need anything, or please come by during advisory. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.